All right, let's dive into something foundational today. We're taking a deep dive into the core concepts of Vue.js, pulling everything from a fantastic YouTube tutorial transcript that really walks through building a little application step by step.
You know that feeling when you're on a website and content just smoothly changes or appears without the whole page reloading? Building that kind of dynamic interface used to involve a lot of tricky manual work directly with the browser.
It was painful. That's exactly where modern UI frameworks like Vue, React, and Angular come in. They give you a structured way to manage all that complexity. And for this dive, we've distilled this specific tutorial to really show you how Vue tackles it.
Our goal here is to grab the absolute most important nuggets and, insights from this material. We want to give you a really clear picture of how Vue.js works, from the very basics of getting data onto the screen to building something quite interactive and structured.
Kind of like a shortcut.
Yeah, think of it as skipping straight to the good parts, understanding the Vue way of doing things.
Okay, so how does it all start? We're talking about moving away from static, hard-coded HTML. Instead, the data should drive what you see. How does Vue make that happen right from the get-go?
It begins with creating a Vue application instance. In Vue 3, the modern way is using the createApp method that Vue provides. It's essentially the starting point for your entire Vue application on the page.
And you give createApp this options object. What exactly is in that sort of brain of the app?
That options object is where you define everything about this specific Vue instance: its data, its methods, its computed properties, all the fundamental pieces. The first key option you'll almost always see is data.
Ah, the data option. This is where you put the actual content you want to show.
Exactly. And importantly, it's defined as a function that returns an object. That object holds all the reactive data for your application.
A function returning an object.
Okay, if you're familiar with React, this is conceptually very similar to its state.
So instead of writing like h1 my hard-coded title 1 directly in HTML, you put page title, my dynamic title, inside this data object that the function returns.
Precisely. The tutorial shows examples like page title and content starting as simple strings in that data object. You're taking the stuff that changes or, comes from elsewhere and putting it into this managed data store.
And then to get that data into the HTML template, there's that specific syntax, the double curly braces.
Nailed it. That's Vue's template syntax for data binding. If you have something like p-content, Vue sees those braces, looks for a content property in your data object, and renders its value right there. It's a direct link.
A direct link between your data and the visible HTML. Okay, so we have the app instance and the data, but how does Vue know which part of my HTML page this app should control?
That's the job of the mount method. After creating your app instance with createApp, you call appInstance.mount, #SUMID. This tells Vue to link itself to the HTML element with that specific ID.
Right.
That element and everything inside it becomes the domain of your Vue application.
And a neat detail from the tutorial, a helpful warning you might see. What happens if you put in your template but never defined missing property in your data?
Vue is quite helpful there. It will actually give you a warning in the browser's developer console letting you know that you tried to access a property in the template that wasn't defined in your data.
Ah, good feedback.
Yeah, it guides you to fix those potential errors quickly.
So the absolute core foundation we've pulled from this tutorial: createApp gets the instance going, the data option holds your dynamic content, displays that data in the template, and mount connects it all to a specific spot on your page. Simple structure to start with.
Right. But static data display is just step one. Most web pages have lists, navigation links, product lists, comments. Hard coding lie after lie is a nightmare, especially if the list changes.
Oh, yeah.
You have the data, usually an array. How does Vue handle repeating HTML elements based on that?
This is where Vue introduces its special attributes, the Vue directives, isn't it?
Exactly. Directives are instructions you put right on your HTML elements to tell Vue what to do. And the one for handling lists or repeating elements is v-for.
v-for.
It looks just like a loop you'd write in JavaScript, but it's living directly in your template.
Like v-for item in my array.
Precisely. You'd apply v-for link in links if links is your array of navigation items. Now, a really key insight the tutorial emphasizes: where do you actually put that v-for directive?
Oh, yeah, this tripped me up when I first saw it. You put it on the element you want to repeat.
Yeah.
So for a navigation list, You put v4 on the individual lie element,
Yes.
not the all container.
That's crucial. If you put it on the eye, you'd end up rendering the entire aisle multiple times, which is almost certainly not what you want.
Right, you get a bunch of lists.
Exactly. Putting it on the lie means Vue repeats that specific list item for every item in your links array.
And inside that repeated lie, you just use link to show the current item's value from the loop.
Yep. Vue makes the current loop item available within the scope of the element where v4 is applied. Simple as that.
The tutorial calls using things like links1, a
Yeah.
horrible way. And I guess that makes sense. It's totally static. If the array changes, your template is broken.
Absolutely. It's brittle.
v4 keeps it dynamic.
Right. It adapts automatically if items are added, removed, or reordered. And a slightly more technical point v4 brings up, which is important for Vue's internal efficiency when lists change, is the key attribute.
The key index thing. What's that actually doing? Is it for the user?
Not for the user, no. When you use v4, especially with objects or when the list might be manipulated, Vue needs a way to uniquely identify each item in the list. The key attribute provides that unique identifier.
Right.
It helps Vue efficiently update the list in the DOM. It knows whether an element moved, was added, or was removed, rather than just trying to re-render everything. It's mainly for performance.
So it's an internal tracking thing for Vue.
Exactly. The tutorial shows using the array index as the key, like v4 item index and items in key index. You need something unique for each item in that iteration.
It all contributes to that declarative feel, right? You look at the HTML with v4, and you can immediately picture the structure of the final output, even though the data is dynamic.
Precisely. You declare what you want the final structure to look like, and Vue figures out how to make the data fit that structure. It's much clearer than generating everything programmatically in JavaScript.
Okay, so we can display data in lists, but websites aren't just static displays. We need to interact with them. We click things. How do we make our Vue app do something when a user clicks on, say, one of those dynamic navigation links?
Well, first, the data needs to evolve a bit. The tutorial shows the navigation links weren't just strings anymore. They needed a URL and perhaps other info. So the links array becomes an array of objects, each maybe with text, URL, and maybe content or an ID.
Right, more structured data.
And initially, the tutorial separates concerns with multiple small Vue apps, but it quickly moves to combining related parts like the navigation and the page content into a single Vue instance.
Makes sense.
With a unified data object that might hold an array of pages, each with title, content, and link info. A single app instance makes managing that shared data much simpler.
Okay, so combined app instance. Now, handling clicks and other user interactions,
For that, Vue gives us the Vion directive.
like vion.click.
Exactly. But you'll almost always see the shorthand, @click. It's more concise and very common in Vue templates.
Okay, at click.
You attach @click to the element you want to respond to, like the lie or a tag in your navigation loop.
And we need a way to know which page is currently visible. So we'd add another data property, maybe active page, initialized to 0 for the first page.
Yes, exactly. Active page in the data object tracks the current state. Now, when the user clicks a link, the magic command becomes something like @click active page index.
Ah,
This tells Vue, when this particular link is clicked, update the active page data property to match the index of this link in the loop.
okay, wait. So I just changed the data, active page index, and Vue automatically updates the HTML to show the correct page title and content based on, say, page active, page title. I didn't have to write any code to find the title element and change its text.
That's it. That's
Yeah.
the core of Vue's reactivity and why these frameworks are so powerful.
Oh, wow.
You modify the application's state, the data, and Vue's reactivity system, which is tracking how your template uses that data, automatically knows which parts of the DOM need to be updated to reflect the new state.
So you declare the relationship in the template.
Right, like page active, page title,
Right.
and Vue handles the low-level DOM manipulation efficiently. It's a huge productivity gain. You're not manually messing with document.getElementById and inner HTML all the time.
That is really interesting. It takes away a whole class of manual DOM manipulation headaches.
Absolutely. And one small but crucial detail for navigation links, a tag click usually navigates the page, right? A full page load. If you're building a single page application where you want to update content without a full reload, You need to prevent that default browser navigation.
And Vue has a modifier for that, right? The .prevent.
Spot on. You add .prevent to your event directive at click.prevent active page index. This tells Vue to run your click handler function and then stop the browser from performing its default action for that event. Super useful for SBAs.
Okay, cool. Now, beyond just showing the right content, dynamic interfaces often need dynamic styling, like making the active navigation link visually different. How does Vue handle changing CSS classes based on data?
This uses another key directive, vbind. It's for binding HTML attributes to your data, like .href, .src, and importantly for styling, .class.
And the shorthand is just the colon bind.
Exactly. You'll see lets you dynamically apply CSS classes.
How does that work? Did you just pass it a string name?
You can pass it a string, but for applying classes conditionally, which is common, you usually pass it an object. The tutorial shows this syntax, .class, class name, condition expression. The property name is the class name as a string, and the value is a JavaScript expression that evaluates to true or false.
And if it's true, the class gets applied.
That's it. So to highlight the active link, you'd use something like .class index. Vue evaluates that condition for each link in the loop and only applies the active class if that link's index matches the current active page data.
Makes sense. You can also pass it an array of classes, I think.
Yes, you can, like .class, navlink, active class variable. The object syntax is probably more common for toggling individual classes based on data, though.
Right.
And just like the tutorial hints, for more complex class logic, you might move that into a computed property to keep the template cleaner, maybe .class active classes. We'll get to computed properties later.
Okay, so we can handle data, lists, events, and even dynamic styling within a single Vue instance. But what happens when your application gets bigger? All the data, methods, and template in one giant file sounds like, well, a mess.
That's the exact problem components solve. They are the fundamental building blocks for structuring Vue applications. Think of them as self-contained, reusable mini applications or UI elements.
Like a component for just the navigation bar, or a component for just displaying a page's content?
Precisely. Each component has its own template, its own data, if needed, its own methods. It's like modularizing your UI.
And why is that such a big deal? Why bother?
It makes your application much easier to manage, develop, and maintain. You can focus on one small piece at a time. Changes are localized within that component.
Less chance of breaking something else.
Right. And you can reuse components across different parts of your application. It takes a potentially unruly monolith and breaks it down into manageable, understandable pieces.
How do you actually define one of these component pieces?
The basic way, shown early on in the tutorial, is using the app.component method on your main app instance. You give it a string name for your component, like page viewer. Lowercase with hyphens is a common convention, and again, an options object.
Another options object, just like the main app.
Structured much the same way, yeah. This options object holds the component's own template, its own data function, its own methods, etc.
So you take the HTML relevant to that piece of UI, like the bit that shows the page title and content, and put it in the component's template option.
Yes, exactly. You encapsulate its structure there. And once it's registered with app.component, you use it in the parent app's template, like you would any HTML tag, page viewer, navbar. Vue knows to render that component's template there.
Okay, but these components aren't isolated islands, right? The parent app needs to give the page viewer component the correct page data to display. How does data flow into a component?
That's where props come in. Props are the mechanism for passing data down from a parent component to a child component. Think of them like the arguments you pass into a function.
You define which props a component expects in its props option, like telling it what arguments it takes.
Exactly. You add a props option to the component's definition object. Initially, this can be just an array of strings specifying the prop names, like props, page title, content.
And then when you use that component in the parent's template, you bind the parent's data to those props using vbind or the shorthand.
Correct. You'd write something like pageviewer.pagetitle, pageactivepage.pagetitle.content, pageactivepage.content.
Let's break that down.
Okay. On the left, page title is binding to the prop named page title that the child component declared it expects. On the right, pageactivepage.pagetitle is a JavaScript expression evaluated in the parent's context. Vue passes the result of that expression down as the value for the page title prop.
And the tutorial made a point about the colon being crucial there.
Very crucial. Leaving off the page viewer page title, page active page.page title would mean you're just passing the literal static string page active page.page title as the prop value. The bot tells Vue to evaluate the right side as a JavaScript expression and bind the result.
Got it. Dynamic binding requires the colon. And inside the component's template or methods, you just access those props directly, like this .page title.
Yes, in the Options API, you can access them just like data properties, usually via this.
Now, a crucial rule they mention about props. You should never try to change a prop from inside the child component. Why is that restriction there?
It enforces a unidirectional data flow. Data flows down from parent to child via props. This makes your application state much easier to understand and debug.
Ah, good.
If a child could arbitrarily change a prop, it would be hard to track where data changes were originating. It leads to messy, hard-to-reason-about code. If a child needs to request a change based on something that happened inside it, it has to communicate up to the parent, which then handles the actual data change.
Okay, so data goes down with props. How does a child component communicate up to its parent? Like the navbar component needs to tell the main app, hey, index 3 was clicked.
The tutorial shows a couple of ways, starting with one that's perhaps less standard Vue now, but illustrates the concept, passing a function down as a prop.
Passing a function. So the parent has a method, and it sends that method down to the child as a prop.
Exactly. The parent defines a method, say handle nav link click, and passes it as a prop to the navbar on link click handle nav link click. Then inside the navbar component, when a link is clicked, it calls this on link click index, essentially invoking the parent's function and passing the index back up as an argument.
That's one way.
Yeah.
But the tutorial highlights the more standard Vue pattern, which is using custom events, right?
Yes, and this is generally the preferred, more idiomatic Vue way. The child component doesn't call a parent's function directly. Instead, it emits a custom event with a specific name using this, the emit event name, optional payload.
It emits an event, like firing off a signal.
Kind of, yeah. And the parent listens for that specific event on the child component tag in its template.
Just like listening to a DOM event with @click.
Exactly the same syntax. You listen for a custom event with @event name method to call. So the parent might have navbar at link clicked update active page. When the navbar component emits link clicked, the parent's update active page method runs, receiving any payload data the child sent along with the emit.
That seems cleaner, maybe more decoupled than passing functions down. It feels more explicit about what the child is doing, not calling a method on the parent, but signaling that something specific happened within the child.
Exactly. Emitting an event like page created or item deleted clearly signals intent from the child's perspective. It's a very common and effective pattern for child-to-parent communication in Vue.
Now, while these basic concepts work, building real-world applications just with script tags and template strings gets really messy fast. Those multi-line template strings that needed escaping were particularly painful in the early examples.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's where the Vue toolchain comes in. Using build tools like Vue CLI or Vite, which the tutorial structure implies later on, is a massive game changer for developer experience.
And the biggest part of that is the single file component, the .vue files.
Absolutely. This solves the template string problem beautifully. In a .u file, you put your template for the HTML structure, your script for the JavaScript logic, and your style for the CSS, all scoped to that single component all in one file.
All together, but separate concerns within the file.
Exactly. No more string escaping. Everything is clearly organized for that component.
And the build tools handle compiling all that into regular JavaScript and CSS.
Yes, they process these .vue files. They also encourage a standard project structure, SRC folder, components folder, views folder, etc., making larger projects much more organized. And instead of globally registering with app.component, you use standard JavaScript import statements to bring components in and register them locally in the components option of their parent component. Much more explicit dependency management.
And you get niceties like the development server with hot module replacement. What does that mean in practice? Like, what's the benefit?
It means you save a change in your code, in your script, template, or styles, and the browser updates almost instantly, usually without even needing a full page refresh.
Quick feedback.
Yeah, it drastically speeds up development feedback loops. You see your changes immediately.
Plus the Vue DevTools browser extension. I've used that. It's incredibly powerful for seeing what's going on.
It really is. Being able to inspect your component tree, see the actual data and props flowing between them in real time, and even live edit data in the browser for debugging is invaluable. It understands Vue's internals in a way generic browser tools just can't.
Okay, so components structure the UI, props pass data down, custom events signal up. But what about data that needs to be shared across components that aren't directly parent-child? Or data that's many levels deep, where passing props down through every single component, prop drilling, gets really tedious.
Yeah, prop drilling is a real pain point in larger applications. The tutorial touches on ways to handle this shared state. While you could technically use things like app.config.global properties to stick data onto this, making it accessible everywhere, Vue 3 offers a much cleaner, more intentional pattern for this kind of hierarchical data sharing. Provide inject.
Provide and inject. How does that work? Is it like global state?
Not exactly global, but it allows an ancestor component to provide some data or functionality, and any descendant component, no matter how deep in the tree, can then inject it by asking for it by name or key. It bypasses the need to pass the prop through all the intermediate components.
So it skips the middleman component.
Exactly. The tutorial uses this to provide access to a core data store object down to the components that need it without every component in between needing to know about it.
Ah, yes, the centralized data store. The tutorial builds this simple JavaScript object completely separate from any single Vue component, right? Like a plain object or class.
Exactly. This object, let's call it pages, like in the tutorial, becomes the single source of truth for the application's core page data. It holds the array of pages internally, maybe using local storage to make it persist between sessions. And importantly, it exposes methods like getAllPages, addPage, editPage, deletePage.
So components that need to display the data, like a list, would inject this pages store and read from it, say, using pages.getAllPages.
Right, they get the current state from the store.
And components that need to change the data, like a create or edit form, also inject the store but call its methods, like pages.addPage, new page data, or pages.editPage, index, updated data.
Precisely. This centralizes the data itself and the logic for manipulating that data. Components just interact with the store's public API, its methods. It keeps the components themselves simpler and focused on the UI.
Okay, we're building a real application now. We have structured UI with components, data flowing down via props or provide inject, communication flowing up via events, and a central place for our core data. But our app is still technically just one HTML page where we show hide content based on active page.
Yeah.
To be a true single-page application with browser history, back button support, and bookmarkable URLs, we need proper navigation, right?
Absolutely. And for that, Vue has its official routing library, Vue Router. It's the standard go-to solution for handling navigation in Vue SPAs.
How do you set that up? Is it built in?
It's not built into the core. You install it as a separate package, npm install Vue Router. Then you create a router instance using create router from the library.
Okay.
You configure it with a history mode like create web hash history, which uses the hashtag in the URL, or create web history for cleaner URLs that usually require server configuration, and most importantly, a routes array.
The routes array is where you map URL paths to specific components.
Exactly. It's an array of route definition objects. Each object defines a path like for the home page, create for a create page, or dynamic paths with parameters like pages.indexedit.
The .index part is the parameter.
Yes, the colon indicates a dynamic segment. And crucially, each route object specifies which Vue component should be rendered when the URL matches that path.
And then you tell your main Vue app to use this router.
Yep. You typically do app.use router to install the router plugin into your Vue application instance.
Okay, so the router knows which component matches create. Where does that component actually get displayed on the page?
In your main apps template, often in app.vue, you put a special component provided by Vue, router.routerView. This acts as a placeholder. The component matching the current active route will be rendered right there inside the routerView outlet.
Ah, it's like a dynamic frame.
Yeah.
And for navigation links, instead of using basic tags, you use router link.
Correct. Router link is another component provided by Vue Router. You use the Aduto prop to tell it where to navigate. It can be a simple string like .create or an object like .path.pages plus index plus edit.
And router link handles updating the URL in the browser bar without doing a full page reload.
Exactly. It intercepts the navigation, tells the router the path change, the router updates the URL using the history API, finds the matching component for the new path, and swaps it into the router view, all seamless within the single page.
Components that the router renders, like that page edit component using pages.indexedit, often need information from the URL itself, like that index parameter. How do they access that?
Good question. They need access to the current route information. In the Options API, components automatically get access to this .route. The parameters are available on this route.params. So you get this .route.params.index.
Okay, route.params. What about the composition API?
In Composition API, you don't rely on this. Instead, you import and use a function provided by Vue Router called useRoute. Calling useRoute gives you access to the current route object, and the params would be on useRoute.params.index.
UseRoute. Got it. Okay, but what if you navigate between two URLs that use the same component, like clicking a link to go from page 0 edit to pages 1 edit? Both use the page edit component. Does the component get destroyed and recreated?
No. By default, Vue Router is efficient. If the component type is the same, it reuses the existing component instance.
So how does the component know to load the data for page 1 when the URL changes from point 0 edit to point 1 edit if it's the same instance?
That's a key point the tutorial covers. Since the component instance persists, its created or mounted hooks don't run again. You need to explicitly react to the route parameter changing within the existing component. One common way is to set up a watch inside the component. You watch the route parameters, either this.watch at Options API or watch.params in Composition API. When the params change, your watcher function runs. And inside that function, you fetch or update the component's data based on the new index from the params.
Okay, watch the route params. What was the other way you mentioned? Something about props.
Yes, that's often considered a cleaner pattern. In your route definition in the router config, you can add props. They're that route.
True. What does that do?
It tells Vue Router to automatically take any route parameters, like index, and pass them down to the routed component, PageEdit, as props. So PageEdit would then declare props index, just like any other prop.
So the param becomes a regular prop.
Exactly. And then inside PageEdit, you can just use a standard watch on the index prop itself, or watch index props.index. When the route changes and router passes the new index value as a prop, your prop watcher fires, and you update the data.
That feels maybe a bit more component-centric. Watching a prop seems more natural than watching the global route object.
Many people prefer it for that reason, yeah. Both work, but passing params as props often keeps the component's logic cleaner and more focused on its inputs, the props.
And just like we saw with dynamic classes earlier, Vue Router can help with styling the active navigation link automatically, right?
Absolutely. The router link component is smart about this. It has an active class prop. You just give it a CSS class name like active class active, and Vue Router will automatically apply that active class to the rendered tag only when that links to prop matches the current active route.
No, that's super handy. No need for manual class binding based on the current path.
Exactly. It simplifies styling navigation menus significantly.
They also touch on nested routes briefly. What's the use case there?
Yes, that's for more complex UI layouts where you have sections within sections. Imagine a user settings page at settings. It might have subsections like settings profile and settings account. The main settings row could render a user settings component that has its own internal router view.
A router view inside a component rendered by the main router view.
Right. And the children routes defined under settings like profile and account would then render their respective components, user profile, user account, inside that nested router view. It's great for organizing UIs with sidebars or tabbed interfaces within a larger page structure.
Okay, that makes sense for complex layouts. Now, as the tutorial progresses, especially in the later stages building the CRU'd app, the code structure for the components themselves starts to look different. They move into something called the Composition API.
Yes, that's a significant shift highlighted in the later parts of the source material. The Options API is what we've primarily discussed so far, structuring your component logic into distinct options like data, methods, computed, watch. Your code is organized by option type.
And the Composition API is different. How does it change how you write a component?
It's a newer way, introduced officially in Vue 3, designed to address some limitations of the Options API in very large components and to improve logic reuse. It allows you to organize code by feature or logical concern rather than by option type. You primarily write your component logic inside a special setup function or, more commonly now, using the script setup syntax on the script tag.
Script setup. What are the key practical differences you see when you look at code written this way? No more data option.
Right, you don't have a data option. You also don't really use this in the same way you do in the Options API methods. You work with variables more directly within the setup scope.
So how do you make things reactive if there's no data?
Reactivity becomes more explicit. You import functions from Vue. For primitive values like strings, numbers, booleans, you wrap them in ref, so you might have const, count, refollow. To access or change the value in your JavaScript code, you use .value, like count.value plus where ref.
And dot value. Okay.
Mhm.
What about objects or arrays?
For objects and arrays, you typically use reactive, like const form state reactive name. You can then modify properties directly, like form state.name new name. Vue handles making these reactive.
Interesting. And in the template, do you need dot value there too?
Now, that's a nice convenience. Vue automatically unwraps the refs in the template, so you can just write or Eve vmodel form state.name directly in your template, just like you would with options API data property.
And instead of defining methods, computed, watch options, you import functions for those too.
Exactly. You import computed and pass it a getter function. You import watch and pass it the source to watch, like a ref or a reactive object, and a callback function. You import lifecycle hooks like onMounted. You also import things like inject, use router directly into your setup script.
The tutorial shows refactoring a component like create page from options to composition. What's the main benefit they're illustrating there? Why make the switch?
In larger, more complex components, the Options API can sometimes lead to the logic for a single feature, like handling a specific form input with its validation, computed states, and watchers, being spread across the data, methods, computed, and watch options. This can make it harder to follow and extract.
Right, you're jumping around the file.
Yeah. The Composition API lets you group all the related reactive state, functions, computed properties, and watchers for that single feature together in one place within the setup function or script block. This can significantly improve code organization and readability, especially in complex components. It also makes it much easier to extract that related logic into reusable, composable functions.
So better organization and reusability for complex logic. Okay, that makes sense. So pulling it all together, the tutorial uses all these concepts: components, reactivity, routing, state management, maybe composition API for the later parts, to build a full CR read, create, read, update, delete UI for managing those pages using the centralized store and Vue router.
Right. It culminates in a practical example. The pages list component, pageslist.vue perhaps, would inject the pages store, use v-for to loop through the result of pages.getAllPages. It might use a computed property, whether options or composition API, to filter that list, say only showing published pages.
And it uses router link.
Exactly. Router link to navigate to the edit page route for each item, like .to pages plus index plus edit, passing the page index as a rep parameter. And it would likely include the delete button, maybe calling a local method, which in turn calls pages.deletePageIndex.
Then the create page component, createPage.view. It also injects the store and maybe an event bus if that's being used for notifications. It uses ref in Composition API or local data in Options API for the form input fields, page title, content, etc.
And vmodel is key here for two-way binding the input elements directly to those reactive variables. A submit button would use that click.prevent to call a local submit function.
And that submit function.
That function would gather the data from the ref or data properties, call pages.addPage with the new page object, maybe emit an event like page created on the bus to notify other parts of the app, like the navbar, and then use the router, maybe inject it as router, use router, to navigate back to the list page, like router.pushPages.
The tutorial also showed a nice touch, like watching the page title ref to automatically update a link text ref, unless the user explicitly edits the link text.
Yeah, those little reactive connections are easy to set up.
And the edit page component, repated.view. Similar structure.
Very similar, but it needs to load existing data first. It injects the store, gets the page index from the route parameters, either via useroute.params.index or from a prop, if prop's true is set on the route.
Right.
It then calls pages.getSinglePageIndex to fetch the data for that specific page. It probably copies that fetch data into local reactive state, a ref or reactive object holding the page details, so the form can be edited without directly mutating the store's data immediately.
Ah, a local copy for editing. Makes sense.
Then vmodel binds the form inputs directly to the properties of that local page object, like vmodel page.pageTitle. This direct binding to object properties is really powerful for forms. It has buttons for submit and cancel.
Submit calls pages.editPage.
Yep. Submit calls pages.editPage, index local page data, maybe emits page updated and navigates back with router.pushPages. Cancel probably just does router.push pages without saving.
And the delete functionality often on the list page.
Usually, yeah. A delete button next to each item in the pages list. It's at click.prevent handler would call a method like delete page index, which in turn calls pages.delete page index on the store, and maybe emits page deleted on the bus.
And that dynamic update we saw earlier, when you add, edit, or delete a page using the store's methods, how does the list or the nav bar automatically update itself? You mentioned the event bus.
That's one common pattern shown. Components like the navbar, maybe showing a count of pages, or the pages list itself could listen for those events. Page created, page updated, page deleted, emitted on the bus after a store operation completes.
And when they hear the event,
When they hear the event, they know the underlying data in the central pages store might have changed. Because they are likely getting their display data reactively from the store, example via pages.getAllPages, which might be reactive itself, or through a computed property that depends on it, Vue's reactivity system kicks in automatically and updates their part of the DOM to reflect the latest data from the store.
so the data changes centrally in the store. An event signals that a change happened if needed for cross-component updates. And Vue's reactivity ensures the UI components reading that data update themselves automatically.
Exactly. You manage the state, Vue manages the UI updates. That's the fundamental contract.
Wow, okay. We've really gone through the whole arc that tutorial presents, from putting a single piece of data on the screen all the way to building a multi-component routed CRUD interface
Yeah.
with a centralized data store, handling user events, dynamic styling, and even looking at different ways to structure the component logic with options versus composition API.
It really showcases Vue's philosophy, I think. It offers an approachable entry point with concepts like reactive data binding and directives, and then provides progressively more powerful tools like components, routing, and state management patterns as your application complexity grows. It's flexible.
Building truly dynamic, responsive interfaces is definitely complex. It requires thinking carefully about how to manage your application state, react instantly to user actions, structure your code logically so it doesn't become a tangled mess down the line, and provide seamless navigation. We've seen how Vue provides a pretty comprehensive and, dare I say, elegant set of tools to handle all of that.
The biggest takeaway, perhaps, is that fundamental shift in mindset compared to older approaches. Focus on declaratively defining your UI based on your application state. Manage that state carefully, and trust the framework to handle the efficient updating of the actual browser elements.
So armed with these core Vue concepts from this deep dive into the tutorials approach, what dynamic UI challenge are you, the listener, excited to maybe tackle next?
And if you want to dig deeper, the official Vue documentation is truly excellent, very well written. Or, even better, try building a small project yourself using these patterns. There's no substitute for hands-on experience to really make these concepts click.